So what I thought I'd do today is start by talking about releases and how we release our design systems. Part of the reason is that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And I think it's one of those, again, which is quite contextual to how you work, how your team works, the volume of components or design decisions you have encoded in your design system. So when we think about releases, certainly for me at least, it makes me think more about code. But if you're using Figma, you'll notice that you can have releases set up in regular Figma documents. Very often you can name these releases too. So what I mean by that is a release is like a snapshot of that moment in time. So you can make some change and say that all of this change is now called release 1. And that gives you a sense of what's in that snapshot, that moment in time. And then if you make more change, you make more additions or deletions, you can make another release and maybe you call it version 2. And so then you've got a sense of, this is where we were at in version 1. We did some things, added some, removed others, made some minor amends. This is now version 2. When it comes to a library as well, that's really important to make sure everyone's using the current version and make sure that this is a change that is intentional. Everyone should be using this. And it just helps to avoid confusion with lots of incremental changes. So when we look at code, there's a long history of versioning. I'm sure any software you've used, you'll notice it's not just version 1, 2, 3. You'll see a dot and then some more numbers, maybe a dot and some more numbers. This tends to use a system called SEMVer, semantic versioning. So you've got major versions, then minor versions, which are subversions of that, and then patch versions, which tend to be small amends or fixes. And so when it comes to your design system, there's a lot of choice to be had. Do you version all of your code base for the design system? Do you go extreme and version every component separately? I think it goes beyond that as well, because if there are versions, how do people consume that? So depending on your architecture and your structure, maybe it's okay for people to pull in a particular version of a particular component. Maybe that's okay. But there's a risk where if versions are out of sync, some people using version 1.3, some people using 1.6 or 7, these all need to be maintained. If there's a bug in it, an older version, do they have to upgrade? Do you fix that? There's just a lot of things to bake into it. The opposite way might be you force upgrade, and so everyone has to use the current version. And that has risk as well, because you have to be quite clear on the scope of change in a release. And so looking at semantic versioning, if you're on like patch numbers, so these are really minor fixes or minor change, that should be low risk. You should be able to update that very, very frequently and painlessly. Depending on how you view change as a whole, your minor releases might be a little bit more impactful. And so you might want to check these out before rolling it out everywhere. But again, it's a case-by-case basis on how you view change, how you manage that across your whole estate. And what is it that's consuming the design system? Is it a native app? Is it a website? Are there multiple apps making the website? There's a lot to go into. And so when you think about breaking change, the major releases, it's trying to be quite clear on what that means to you. Is that substantial visual change? Is that a substantial technical change? Really, those major versions should be quite rare. It should be something that maybe starts off quite cloudy, like when do we know we've got a major version? And to my mind, that would be something certainly outside the realm of a single component or a single group of components. But that's something that you need to define with your setup and your amount of releases. So if you look across your estate and think about, these are all the places that are consuming from a design system, it's that trying to get that balance which is right for you. If you don't have a lot of change in your design system as a whole, maybe you version the whole thing and if in code you have everything as an npm repo, so this is a repository full of JavaScript, you might just say, okay, well, versioning the whole thing is fine for us. We don't have a huge amount of change happening. We don't have a huge amount of components. So that might make perfect sense. At my last place, we kind of loosely followed atomic design. So we had a number of layers of complexity. And it felt right to us to version those layers. And what we found was some layers have more activity than others. And so the very smallest atoms don't tend to change a huge amount. They didn't for us anyway. The next layer up, where you've got more significant components, there was more change happening there. That's where most of the change tended to happen. And the layer we had above that was almost full sections of layout. There's some change there, but not a huge amount. So that helped us in that way to work out, well, we kind of have most of the change happening here. This is where most of the risk is in terms of the impact of change when we release something. So it's one of those where you need to try and get a handle on what are your expectations for your design system. If you have loads and loads of people consuming the design system all over the place, that needs managing somehow. And that means managing in terms of risk as well. So if a change goes out, and maybe there's a bug in it, maybe there's an unintended consequence, how do you follow that up with a forward fix? That would be preferable than rolling back most of the time. So it's not just about releases. It's about thinking about how we embed change into the design system itself. So going back to design, should the design be the same version as code? Probably not, because the nature of change inside the components will be very, very different. It might be there that change is needed for some reason in design that isn't needed in code. So to my mind, I don't think they should be bound. There might be a relationship between them. And so if a change came from design, you might want to reference it in code. And that could be through a commit message in Git. It could be mentioned in your release notes. Just to draw the fact that there is a relationship here. I think change as a whole is quite hard, but it's really, really important, because you need to know that whatever happens, whatever you learn over time, you can actually apply and roll out. It means understanding that risk isn't a bad thing. It's something you can be aware of, and you can try and plan ahead a little bit and work out where is the risk, how can we acknowledge that risk, and how can we put things in place which make it less of a problem. So I think releases are the real tangible part of thinking about change. So if you also think about naming becomes really, really difficult if you don't think you can change it. Little alert on the screen. If you think about this decision being etched in stone almost, you're going to stress over that naming. You're going to want to get it perfect. But in my opinion, if you know you can roll out change and say, if we were to change our naming conventions in design tokens, for example, we've got a rough idea of what the impact might be, how much effort that might take. And so you can try and look ahead and think, hopefully we'll learn more over time and we'll feel more confident, we'll have different challenges, and we can change these. So if you look at naming of components or tokens, if you want to change them, you should be able to. There will be an impact, but if done for the right reasons, because you're learning and improving, thinking about releases, thinking about pipelines, do that early, and you can bake change into your design system. And that's absolutely massive. These things need to change and evolve over time. So if you think about everything from naming, if that's less stressful because you know you can change it, if you have layers like atomic design and decide, actually, that's not right for us, maybe we don't want that, you should be able to change it. Sometimes you hear of very large companies going through maybe the third or fourth design system. And that always makes me wonder why. And I'm sure there's lots of different reasons. But I feel like if you bake change into your process and assume that everything will change over time. And kind of bake that into the conversations you have. I think things can be a lot better. You should be able to change your mind. You should be able to learn more. And that shouldn't mean you need to have a whole new design system. You should be able to swap bits out. You should be able to improve, change tooling, change tech. These are all parts of the system, and each part should be able to change and evolve in its own way. I'd love to hear how you do it, how your company, your organization handle releases, handle change management as a whole, and what impacts you've had, because I don't think it's a space that anyone has completely nailed. I think, again, it's very contextual. So what works for one company might not work for another. So I'm really curious to hear what you do.